It's very interesting to see Keir Starmer kind of puffing up his chest about the importance of protecting Ukraine's borders and Ukraine's sovereignty from Russian aggression, but he can't control Britain's borders. He can't control his own borders, and we have people crossing over who have had associations with radical Islamist movements and who hold hateful, bigoted, regressive views that pose a threat to national security.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm John Connolly, the Spectator's news editor. Who is arriving on Britain's shores, and do they represent a national security threat? Joining me to discuss is Spike's Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. It's always a pleasure. You wrote this week for Coffee House about a man called Abu Wadii who entered into Britain from the Channel across one of the small boats last week. Start us off, can you tell us a bit about this man and why in particular people are worried about him coming into the country?
Yeah, it's a worrying development. So Abu Wadii is from Gaza. He seems to have made his way to Britain, and he posted a video of himself seemingly crossing the Channel and arriving in the UK, saying, "Thank God we finally arrived in Britain." And this is a man who reportedly has a pretty dodgy track record. I mean, there are images of him online posing with an AK-47, posing with projectiles that he reportedly threw towards the Israeli border. He's a man who has seems to have sung the praises of Hamas. And worst of all, there are allegations that he's used his social media to call for the slaughter of Jews, to say that Allah should come and kill the Jewish people, and to really just spout anti-Semitic bile about the problematic Jewish people as he sees them. This is not the kind of person we want in our country. And one of the points I make in my piece for Coffee House is that I think Jewish security needs to be a central part now of our border security. You know, who is coming to this country? And is a big question that we should always ask ourselves. And one of the reasons people should not be allowed into this country, I think, is if they harbour violently anti-Semitic views. Kick them out.
As you say, it's pretty worrying. We should probably say that Abu Wadii has been charged by the Home Office of entering the country unlawfully or unauthorised. But there is kind of a broader problem, I think, and you touched on this in your piece, which is that we maybe are seeing more people come into the country from Gaza. For all the suffering there, it is also a place that has a pretty big problem often with anti-Semitism. Is that something in particular you worry about?
Yeah, hugely. You know, there is this, amongst the left, there is this sense that people in Gaza need our help. We should let them come here. We should let refugees come to the UK from Gaza. No one doubts that what's happening in Gaza is awful. People are suffering enormously. I think Israel had every right to fight against Hamas. I still think it does. But it has caused huge suffering, as wars always do. So people there need assistance. They need help. And many of them will need to be refugees at some point, I think, in the countries around Gaza. But I do think we have to get real here in Britain about who we allow into the country. And the truth of the matter is that Gaza has had a violently anti-Semitic government for almost 20 years, i.e. Hamas, the Hamas ministry, Hamas militants. It's a country in which there is a lot of anti-Semitic fervour, anti-Semitic feeling. We know from numerous reports that in some schools in Gaza, including UNRWA-run schools, there are lessons in anti-Semitism. There are lessons in which kids are taught to hate Israel and even to hate Jews. So we have to be careful. We have to prioritise, I think, our own national security and particularly the security of the British Jewish people. We have a lot of Jews in this country. They have a long history here. They have every right to live in safety and dignity. And therefore, we have to be careful not to throw open the doors to people who come from a part of the world which tragically has a problem with anti-Semitism. So I do think we have to be on our watch when it comes to refugees from Gaza.
And I think it's the case as well that the Abu Wadii is probably quite an unusual individual in the sense that he's got quite a large social media presence. He does these TikTok videos with thousands of followers. His views, what they are, were kind of picked up quite quickly once he entered in the country, which, you know, he self-posted the video himself seemingly arriving in the country. That's not going to be the case for a lot of individuals. I kind of imagine then that a lot of this isn't going to get picked up at present. Is that right?
Yes, that's the issue. I was thinking exactly the same thing, that this is a guy who has a large social media presence. He has lots and lots of followers on social media. So it was relatively easy to trace his history of the things that he said and the things that he's done. And the campaign against anti-Semitism did a really good job on telling us who this guy is. But as you say, there will be lots of other people coming here who we know nothing about, whose names we don't know, whose histories we don't know. Have they been involved in Hamas? Have they been involved in other radical Islamist groups? Do they still hold those views? We just don't know when it comes to a lot of the people coming on the small boats in particular. I do think we have a crisis at our border at the moment. And I'm someone who's pretty liberal and open-minded on the question of immigration. I'm not a close the borders person, but I do think we need to know who is crossing our borders, whether they have the right to, whether they are doing it legally, which is one thing, or illegally, which is another thing entirely. We have to ask ourselves these questions. And it's very interesting to see Keir Starmer kind of puffing up his chest about the importance of protecting Ukraine's borders and Ukraine's sovereignty from Russian aggression, which, by the way, I think is a very noble goal. That's something that people should support. But he can't control Britain's borders. He can't control his own borders. And we have people crossing over who have had associations with radical Islamist movements and who hold hateful, bigoted, regressive views that pose a threat to national security. So for him to pontificate about the sanctity of Ukrainian borders while essentially allowing our own to become increasingly porous, that's an unsustainable position. And I do think we have to get much more serious about what's happening on our borders, what's happening on our shores, who's coming here, and what we're going to do about it.
I think a problem as well, Brennan, is that once we've identified that someone may be a danger to this country who's crossed the border, it's not really clear what we can do next. I think the Conservatives have raised, in the case of Abu Wadii, the fact that it may be difficult to deport such an individual, for example, because of our human rights law. Here's a problem, isn't it? Are we going to send people back to Gaza, for example?
It's a dual problem. On the one hand, we're not policing our borders properly. And on the other hand, once people do cross our borders, which they're doing in their hundreds and their thousands, there's not much we can do about it, or it takes a very, very long time because we are signatories to the Refugee Convention, or we're signed up to human rights legislation, or there are these various international treaties and ideas that we are subscribers to, which actually tie our hands in terms of what we can do. I think all of those things, it's become increasingly clear that they are an attack on our sovereignty and on not just our sovereignty, but other nations' sovereignty too. And a key part of being a sovereign nation is that you get to say who and what may cross your borders, what goods may cross your borders, what people may cross your borders. That is a central part of being a sovereign democratic nation. And at the moment, that part of our sovereignty has been completely watered down, partly by a lack of control at our borders, but also because of all this legislation we have that we've introduced into our own system, which means it's very difficult sometimes to expel or deport illegal migrants. We need to chop away a lot of that stuff. I think we need a much more realistic asylum system where we do offer assistance to people around the world who genuinely need it. For example, the Ukrainian scheme is a good example of that, or the Hong Kong scheme, where we do offer meaningful assistance to people who are in real strife. But at the same time as doing that, I think we need to dismantle that legislative infrastructure that prevents us from taking action against illegal migrants, people who claim to be asylum seekers but aren't really, and people who we don't want to have in the country. So it's a dual process where I think we should be open to taking in people who need somewhere to go, but we also need to be much firmer and much clearer in stating our desire to kick out of the country people who don't belong here.
And the fact that we aren't at the moment, and there are people and individuals who seem to sort of profess, loyalty towards Hamas, for example, or antipathy towards Jews. This is obviously coming at a time of what seems like rising anti-Semitism in the UK. What kind of message do you think that's sending to Jewish people who live in Britain?
I think it's sending a terrible message. And I know a lot of Jewish friends of mine feel increasingly insecure or uncertain. And I did a talk at a Jewish centre just last week in London. And a lot of the people I spoke to said that they just feel, they're not packing their bags. They're not ready to leave or anything like that, although I'm sure some are. but they do feel that Britain is not the same as it used to be. And that's a really tragic thing for any of our communities to feel. So the Jewish community already feels under pressure because since 7th of October 2023, we've seen almost weekly marches where not only radical Islamists, but also clueless leftists have gathered on the streets, in some cases to express outright support for Hamas, but at least to express utter derision and hatred for the world's only Jewish nation. We've seen people waving placards where the swastika is tangled up with the Star of David. We've seen people saying that Zionists run the BBC and Zionists run America and Zionists run Britain. These kind of classic anti-Semitic tropes with a bit of, PC coverage in terms of saying Zionist instead of Jew. So they've seen all of that for the past 16, 17 months. And now they're hearing that, courtesy of our porous borders, people are coming here who seem to have had associations with Hamas. That's incredibly threatening, I think, to the Jews of Britain. They deserve to have safety and dignity, and at the moment they don't, partly because there is surging anti-Semitism within Britain itself, and also because we're not taking necessary measures to keep anti-Semites out of Britain. So it's a real mess. And I think if we're serious about our national security and serious about Jewish security, we need to get a handle on both of those things.
Thank you very much, Brendan.